One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The treasurer.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that demystifies the big economic issues in Australia and puts them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our summer series, where we're bringing you conversations from our webinars in 2021. This episode, we revisit an important conversation about raising the age of criminal responsibility for children and how we get children out of prison altogether. We spoke to Julie Williams, a Gamilaroi woman and Mount Druitt Community Engagement Officer at Just Reinvest in New South Wales, Meena Singh, a Yorta Yorta woman and PhD candidate from the University of Melbourne, Sophie Trevitt, Executive Officer at Change the Record, and Dr. Nick Fancourt, Paediatrician at the Menzies School of Health Research. This episode was recorded live on the 8th of September 2021, and things may have changed since recording. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So g'day, Sophie, Julie, Meena and Nick. Thanks so much for joining us today. Sophie, to kick us off, I wonder if you can tell us about the Raise the Age campaign and why we need to raise the age of criminal responsibility.
Hi, Ev and everyone. Thanks so much. I'm also zooming in from Ngunnawal country like Ebony, and I feel very lucky to be on this beautiful unceded country during lockdown. I also pay my respects to elders past and present, always, but particularly in light of the conversation we're having today around Raise the Age. So I want to start by saying that Raise the Age is a campaign that came about because of the way in which these unjust laws impact on very young children under the age of 14, and particularly on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. Today is September the 8th, which is actually the anniversary of when Auntie Tanya Day, her birthday, she passed away as a result of public drunkenness laws in Victoria, which is why I'm wearing pink. And the connection there, I guess, is that we have a whole system of unjust laws in the criminal legal system that hurt particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but a large number of people within our communities. That horrific death also sparked a community change and a big campaign which led to the overturning of public drunkenness laws in Victoria. And I guess out of this horrible tragedy, we saw the power of communities and families coming together and lobbying governments for reform. And that's what we're hoping to achieve with the Raise the Age campaign. The campaign to get children out of prison has been going on for a really long time and has been led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly, at least in my experience, Aboriginal grandmothers who have been at the forefront of campaigning for their kids and their grandkids to be kept safe from prisons and harmful interventions. About a year ago, we built on some of that, that long legacy of work and brought together a range of organisations, medical organisations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, human rights, legal organisations. I think there are 100 organisations now as part of our Raise the Age coalition who all came together under the shared banner of trying to keep children as young as 10 out of the criminal justice system, make sure that they can't be arrested, can't be hauled before courts, can't be trapped in this cycle, this damaging institution of the criminal legal system, which so often takes kids away from their families and their community and schooling, and can really set them on a trajectory that ultimately causes them harm for the rest of their lives. So we launched the campaign last year. We were hoping that Attorney Generals would get on board and would commit to Raise the Age. That hasn't happened across the board. It's a state and territory issue, so we need every state and territory to change their laws. But we have seen some progress. The ACT has committed to raise the age to at least 14, and they're in the process now of drafting that legislation. So that's extremely exciting. But other states and territories have been much slower to move. So we're currently watching Victoria and Western Australia really closely, with the hope that they will be the next states to move and to raise the age to 14. But what we know we really need now is we've convinced decision makers on the policy, on the fact that locking up kids doesn't keep the community safe. It hurts children. It hurts families. What we need now is to show decision makers that they have the support of the public and that they can be brave and change these laws, and that the majority of Australians will back them in doing that.
Thanks, Sophie. Julie, I wanted to come to you next. As a parent of a child who was caught up in the criminal legal system and through your work in Just Reinvest, can you tell us a little bit about what it's like for kids and their families who really what they need is support and services, but end up being met with a police response instead? I imagine it must be incredibly both scary and infuriating.
As a parent, it was a big struggle for me because it was a long process that became, over 2 years of waiting and finding that right support for myself and my daughter. So my daughter, when she started hanging around that wrong age group, the wrong crowd, become in trouble. And I struggled just trying to find a service that could support me because my daughter wasn't 12. So it made even the process feel even longer because as a parent, I was trying to do everything I could to try and get that support for my daughter where I just couldn't get that anywhere. That's why I have a big thing around early intervention where I believe if, families are helped a little earlier in the process, then it wouldn't turn out that bad at the other end. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah.
Yeah. And so when you say your daughter was around 12, was that an issue where services were designed for kind of different ages than your daughter was at the time? Or was it just that you couldn't find any services available to you? What kind of problems did you encounter?
She wasn't 12, so I couldn't find any services to support us. So a lot of the services out here in Mount Druitt where they only support children who are 12. And then the next thing I struggled with was because she, got into so much trouble and then had so many charges where I still couldn't be supported until all those, charges went through the system and she was fully sentenced on those until we were given that support. So it was well over 2 years in and out, going to court where we didn't receive nothing. And finally, when we did receive that support from a service, they could only work with my daughter for 12 weeks. So, but it was really, I was grateful that that service could extend at the time for another 8 weeks, I think it was. So, but that helped that it could be extended, but a lot of services only have those where they would work for that time frame and that's it. So then you're looking for another service to support you.
Yeah. We might come back a little bit to some of those experiences, Julie, but Mina, looking at the legal side of things, what kind of age are we talking about that kids are going into prisons and what are some of the main problems that children encounter once they get caught up in this system?
Yeah, well, because the age of criminal responsibility is so low as 10 years of age, that's exactly when kids can go to jail. And we've seen kids, whether it's being arrested and put into custody, held on what we call remand, which is you're still waiting for your legal matter to be finished. So you're still waiting to be sentenced. Kids could be held in jails, in police cells, which of course is highly traumatic. Any experience with the criminal legal system is incredibly traumatic. And, we see when you look at the types of offending that are going on, when you're talking about kids as young as 10 and up to that 14 years of age, that sort of group, you're really talking about offending that doesn't require much forethought or planning. You're really talking about spur of the moment type activity. So maybe stealing a chocolate bar or a drink from a shop, or maybe engaging in criminal damage. The types of offending is very low. And if we're not addressing what that sort of behaviour is and where it's coming from, if we're not looking holistically at what the child's environment is, what struggles they might be facing, are they connected with school? Are they connected with culture, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids? What's going on with family and stuff. If we're not looking at the child's circumstances holistically, any response that doesn't address those things, any response that just, throws a kid in prison and leaves it at that, won't lead to long-term change or long-term positive outcomes. And there's research to say that the earlier a child becomes engaged with the criminal legal system, the more likely they are to return to it as they get older and into adulthood. And, there's so much research also that says that prisons do not rehabilitate. Prisons are not positive places. They're inherently violent places where there's a huge imbalance of power. A child going into prison is subject to things such as strip searches, which, if it wasn't for the law, would be considered sexual assault. So, these sorts of traumas that children are experiencing at a very young age is highly damaging unless it's addressed with trauma-informed responses.
Yeah, that's just awful to think about, those types of things happening to kids as young as 10, 11, 12. That's primary school age. And I'm sure there's a lot of parents on the line with us today. Nick, as a paediatrician, I can't imagine that incarceration is in any way beneficial to the health and development of kids as young as 10. Can you reflect on some of those health impacts that kids are encountering?
Yeah, thanks, Ebony. I think there are really two things to say about that. One is that children as young as 10, and certainly all adolescents, through what is a really crucial stage of development, right? This is a time when we're sort of learning to disconnect a bit from family and to create our own identity and develop our own sort of independence and learn all these skills while we're surrounded by school and education and community and, all these important features that help to drive that developmental transition. Those are complicated times in the best of circumstances. And there are times when we know, from a scientific point of view, from a neuroscience, brain science point of view, brains are still developing until the early 20s. And they're developing things, as things that we may take for granted, like impulse control, executive function and sort of understanding the world around us. And physically, kids are also small, right? The average weight of a 10-year-old child is about 32 kilos for a boy and smaller for a girl. These are very small, vulnerable children. And then what we layer on top of that is that the cohort that the justice system tends to capture is actually a cohort of children who are significantly disabled. And they're often disabled because their brains haven't developed properly for a variety of reasons. And that leads them into emotional responses that the symptom that we see is aggression and disruptive behaviour, and that's how they end up in the justice system. But what it means to us from a developmental perspective is actually we've got children who might be 10 or 14 or 16, but if you actually spend some time with them, do some proper psychology assessments, what you find is that their level of functioning is often less than 10. And so we're, got this cohort of very, very vulnerable kids who are not always performing at their chronological age.
Yeah, that's quite confronting, isn't it? I mean, Sophie, coming back to you, as a white girl growing up, I was always told to trust in the police. I would obviously have an extremely different experience than Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. As a lawyer, you talked about when you went to Alice Springs and were practicing in Alice Springs that, that you were not aware of a single non-Indigenous child that was incarcerated in that youth detention centre. What does that tell us about how this system is failing Aboriginal kids in particular?
Yeah, I mean, Julie will also be able to talk to this and about the way in which Aboriginal kids in particular are targeted and harassed by police, as well as sort of entrenched at every stage of the criminal legal system. I'll just say the first thing off the back of some comments that Nick made. I really think that there's this real spectrum of kids that are getting caught up in the criminal legal system. Some of the kids that we find who are being held in detention centres for really long periods of time have these, like a whole bunch of different things going on. They might have physical illness, they might have disabilities, a whole bunch of things that make them particularly vulnerable. But you also get kids who are just being naughty. Like kids that I worked with in Alice Springs were doing seriously naughty things, like throwing rocks at a car or graffitiing private businesses. These are naughty things that are causing people damage and are, understandably making people angry and upset and maybe costing money. But they're also normal behaviours. But when that kid is then confronted with police, maybe they're assaulted by police, when they are routinely put into police cells, when they're held in detention centres, that then becomes a part of a system that's very hard to get out of. So you effectively trap and normalise children in these extremely punitive, damaging institutions, as opposed to doing what you could do, which is engage with that young person, find out why aren't they attending school, what's going wrong there that means that kid isn't able to engage in the classroom, or is something going wrong at home, that means that they don't want to be hanging around at home at night, or are they actually just caught up with the wrong crowd? Like all of us, definitely I was when I was a teenager, but like you, Ebony, as a white girl from an affluent family, that didn't attract the police. It attracted the attention of my teachers, who then provided me with support, which is a very different response to the response that, say, kids that I worked with in Tennant Creek or Alice Springs received, which is that the police are often called to the school by teachers and kids are arrested at school. Or you have situations like Julie described where kids are going through a really tough time and families are trying to get them help and support, and that's being denied to them. And they're being locked out of the services that we all should be providing for kids and young people to try to make sure they can grow and thrive in their homes, in their communities, in their schools. So I think that's the sort of broad point. To the point of that you specifically asked about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, when I worked in Alice Springs and the Barkly region, I never saw a non-Aboriginal child be incarcerated. That's not to say that it never happened, but I was there for 3 years and it never happened in the Barkly region when I was there. And I think that that's because of a range of points in time at which the system discriminates against these kids. It's from police targeting and harassing kids, and the kids would tell you, that this particular cop knows them, knows their family. We will refer to them by name and their family by name and say that, they know that these are bad kids. So we know what happens at that point. It happens in the courtrooms. There are, it is like an unfortunate reality that courtrooms and the legal system is not a neutral space. You may have seen in the news there was an investigation over a judge in Alice Springs who presided over matters with kids that I represented, who was openly racist in court repeatedly. So, there are biases entrenched within the legal system, and there have been a number of studies that show that Aboriginal kids are more likely to be sentenced to time behind bars than non-Indigenous kids who commit the same crimes. So you've got two kids being naughty, doing something wrong. Aboriginal kids are sent to prison. Non-Aboriginal kids are maybe put on community orders, good behaviour bonds, things that take them out of the criminal justice system. And then you have, when these kids do go through that process, they're put into prisons for longer when they're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. So this is a whole system that has discrimination built in at every single point along the way.
Julie, I'll come to you next. Is that your experience in the Mount Druitt community, that Aboriginal kids kind of get a tougher time from police and that type of thing?
Yeah, I think it is, because, my daughter, had non-Indigenous friends as well, where, my daughter would automatically be also refused, but where others with her, at the same place, same time, they wouldn't get what my daughter was getting either. So yeah, I do believe that happens, yes.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the work you do as a community engagement officer in Mount Druitt with Just Reinvest? What are the types of things that you do? What supports do families need?
Well, at the moment, it's around having conversations with mobbing community, having yarns with them, what, myself talking about what my struggle is, and then they're comfortable, having that yarn, what their struggles are with services and police and whatever's going on for them.
Yeah. And how long have you been doing that now, Julie? Do you feel like those sorts of things, that there's better services available now than when you were kind of struggling to look for things for your daughter, or is it still really a struggle for a lot of families?
I believe it's still really a struggle, just because of yarns I have with mobbing community as well, where they're struggling with what I was struggling with in similar situations. So it does still happen.
Yeah. Mina, coming to you next, I guess, for a lot of people probably who are watching, they won't have necessarily even engaged with the legal, the criminal legal system or the criminal justice system at all. It can be really hard, I think, for people to imagine what these kids are going through, or the different backgrounds. Is that a bit of an obstacle to people coming on board with this campaign, that, that idea that, well, I knew right from wrong when I was young, that type of thing? Do you encounter a lot of that in this campaign?
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot that isn't known willfully or however, for whatever reason, about the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, and how invasion and colonisation has led to entrenched disadvantage now, and the basic denial of rights to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people compared to non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and has just created very different outcomes for our community. And so people tend to look at this situation. I find two things. First thing, people are shocked when they hear that children as young as 10 can be put into jail and can be arrested, and the whole works.
A lot of that comments today. Yep.
Yeah. And then the second thing is that people often move very quickly to if they've done the wrong thing, then that's appropriate. Or that idea of, I knew right from wrong at 10 years of age. We're talking about kids who haven't had the advantages that a lot of us have had. If you think about the things that keep us out of prison, if I think of the things that have kept me safe, it's things like, always having a stable household, my parents always being in employment, having been connected to high school and primary school, having uninterrupted education, not having significant health issues, no mental health issues growing up, no significant traumas growing up. All of those things keep us safe. And, if you think of any of those things coming into play, you start to kind of, create a picture where kids become much more vulnerable to acting out, acting in those naughty ways, as Sophie said, or acting in more serious ways that get them in trouble with the law. So we really need to think about what are the experiences of these kids. And like Julie's shared with us, her experiences and her daughter's experiences, this is who we need to listen to. We need to hear voices of those people who are experiencing the legal system, because they're the ones that are actually the experts of the criminal legal system, not us lawyers, not us, the judges or the decision makers, the police. It's actually people experiencing these very oppressive systems that have the knowledge and the expertise to be able to say, this is what's needed. So, to hear Julie say very clearly, we needed programs for younger kids. We need programs that go longer than 12 weeks. That's where the knowledge is, and that's where the expertise is, what we really need to hear.
Yeah, Nick, coming back to your experiences, we've obviously seen a lot about Dondale in particular in the Northern Territory. Do you think there's an understanding in the community of kind of just how damaging incarceration can be for children?
I think we've still got a long way to go to get a good understanding in the community about what this means. I think we're 5 years after the Royal Commission, and we're still seeing a government that's reversing changes directly made in response to that commission. So we're on a path backwards, and I think the government is responding in part to a lot of misunderstanding in the community. So there's a lot to be done, I think, to for all of us to be talking to each other, educating our community and other members in our professions and our next door neighbours. There's a lot to be done, as Julia and Mena has said, around really providing a voice for children, young people and their families, so that these things are not just testimonials in a royal commission. These are everyday stories that we understand and hear from on a regular basis.
Yeah. And Sophie and Mina, I'm not sure which of you might answer this, but for people who are kind of like, okay, well, if a kid's stolen a bike or graffiti, yes, I can see that you'd want to divert them. But for more serious offenders, surely this is the system that should work for them. They should be behind bars. What is the response to the campaign to people who, I guess, are worried about that public safety element?
Yeah, absolutely. People are right to be concerned about their safety. But we need to have responses that respond to the individual child who's committed the offence and look at exactly what that child's circumstances are. As Nick said before, we could have kids who are 14, 15, 16 who are behaving or acting cognitively at a much younger age. So, we need to have responses to offending that match up with the child's individual experiences and have age-appropriate responses to what this offending is. And, it's very likely that if a child is engaging in more serious offending, somewhere earlier they've engaged in very low-level offending, and that's where, as Julie said earlier, there needs to be that early intervention and that addressing of what's going on. And looking at it from a few different angles in terms of, are they engaged with education? What's their mental health like? What's the physical side of things going on for them? Are they connected with culture? Have they got ties with families? Are they in a safe space at home? All of these things need to be addressed. But, we need to think differently about how we respond to things, and simply locking up children in prison might keep communities safe for that period of time, but it doesn't address what's going on for that child and why that offending has happened in the first place.
Yeah, and my roommate used to be a criminal lawyer, Sophie. She always used to explain to me about how being incarcerated really, has such a huge impact on people's lives. And what the community doesn't understand is that most people end up back in the community, unless you're Ivan Milat. All of these people are actually part of our community. The idea should be to rehabilitate them, and then they are going to end up in the community. That's obviously particularly obvious for children. So I think you're still on mute there, Soph, but can you just tell us how important it is, that the focus does shift to rehabilitation, because, obviously these are little kids right at the start of their life.
Totally. I think the first thing to say is that it's actually very, very rare for children under the age of 14 to commit any of these sort of serious crimes. That's much more common in older cohorts. So, late teens and adulthood. Having said that, the principles still apply, right? Like, what is the point of taking folks who do something, even something serious, putting them in a place where all the evidence tells us they are more likely to offend again in the future and worse because of that experience within prisons and the correctional system? So these places do nothing to keep us safe, the rest of the community safe in the long term, and they certainly do nothing to help those individuals. And that's the case for adults. And then when you think about it for a child, taking a child, as Mina said, there are a range of things that we have in our life that help us grow healthily and keep us strong and mentally well and physically well. And some of those things are education, going to school, being connected with our families, being connected with culture, being connected with our community. All of those things are ripped away when we take a child out of their family and put them in a detention centre or in a prison. So when we think about, well, what happens on that very, very rare instance where a child does something seriously wrong, I guess I have two questions. One is, how does it make any sense that we can say a 10-year-old is too young to be held criminally responsible for shoplifting, but if they do something seriously wrong, then it is okay to hold them criminally responsible and send them to prison? That doesn't make any sense. The second point is, when a young person does something seriously wrong on the rare occasion, we have to look at that kid and go, okay, something has gone seriously wrong in that child's life. A child doesn't act with extreme violence. They don't behave in a way that is repeatedly destructive unless something has gone wrong. And it's our job as adults in the community to go, okay, where are the gaps? Where are the needs that are not being met for that child? How do we meet them to make sure that that child is safe and healthy and well, and also the whole community is kept safe and healthy and well? So that might mean not sending them to prison, but having a look, as Nick said, and going, okay, is there an underlying disability here? Or is there a health need that actually needs to be treated? Or is this child acting up so badly and not engaging with school because there is a learning issue? And actually what we need is to support that child to be able to learn, in a school environment. And maybe that means it needs to look like something different. Or is there something seriously wrong going on at home? Has that child been exposed to trauma that we need to address? And how do we do that in a way that isn't re-traumatizing? So not just by involving the child protection system, which we know is often a funnel straight into the criminal justice system, but how do we engage with that family? How do we engage with social services and family support services to make sure that kid is getting the best care and support, and so are their family that they need? Those are the questions we should be asking. Every time we send a child to prison, there have been so many adults along the way who could have intervened and helped if they were given the resources and the backing to be able to provide that child with something better than sending them to a prison cell.
Can I just to reflect on that a little bit and just maybe flip that around, Sophie, because it's the experience that we have, right? Is that from a health sense, we see these kids, a group of these kids when they're young, we pick them up for various different reasons, because somehow they've made it through to their GP and to the health services. And we're seeing, there's been a bit of conversation around fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, for instance, in the chat. Like, we see these kids when they're young and we get them onto early intervention plans and supports early in life. There's another group of kids who come through the education sector and are picked up by education, identified as having high needs and problems, and the same with child protection services. There are still good people who work within stretch child protection services, particularly in the territory, and they do pick up some of these kids in different ways. It's just that we have this set of children who, for many of them, the first time they hit someone who can look at this sort of issue in a health and disability or sort of high needs framework is when they're within a justice framework. And the justice system at the moment isn't set up to respond to that. And so, we know we've got the ability to do early intervention and identification, and we see some of those children. But the children who hit justice first are the ones who are left wanting and have the worst experience, because that side of social services hasn't yet adjusted to thinking and delivering services in this way.
Excellent. We might go to questions from the audience now. The first one is from Abhishek, who asks, what factors have prevented state and territory governments from increasing the age of criminal responsibility? Mina or Sophie, do you want to take that one? Soph?
Sure. So I think the short answer to this is that these are political factors. In the conversations that we have with politicians, I would say the vast majority, it's extremely rare that a politician will come back and say, I don't agree. We think that kids should go to prison. That is the best response. The vast majority of members of parliament are coming back and saying, we agree that the criminal justice system is harmful. We have heard the messages from, otherwise quite conservative institutions like the AMA, the Law Council of Australia. We've heard these medical authorities saying that it's not doing these kids any good. It's also harming these kids. It makes it more likely that they will grow up and be unemployed, be homeless, develop mental health issues. Like, there's so much damage that comes from sending a child to prison. Politicians at large accept that, but what they say to us is, you need to show us that the community will support us if we raise the age. I think for so long, state and territory and Commonwealth governments have approached their role and electoral cycles in particular with a law and order, tough on crime response. And often there's been a real race to the bottom when it comes to who can go harder and tougher when it comes to youth crime, also, a lot of racial fear-mongering. We saw that with some of the fear-mongering in Melbourne around African youth gangs. We see this time and time again, and it works, right? We've seen through the electoral cycle that this often works. So there needs to be a powerful incentive for members of parliament to stop doing that and to engage with something else. And I think we have seen some signs that that is possible. There were some really aggressive law and order campaigns run in the Northern Territory and in Queensland at the last elections, which did not return those parties to power. But both those states have recently passed some extremely punitive youth justice laws in response to public pressure and a lot of media misinformation. So I think that there are two big, areas of work that we have ahead of us. One is about educating the media and trying to change some of that really base level fear-mongering, cheap shot, law and order media campaigning that we see in the tabloid press in particular. And the other side of it is demonstrating to our local members of parliament that the community is behind them, that we know from some polling that the Australia Institute did that the majority of Australians don't know that 10-year-olds are sent to prison, and when they find out, they think that that's wrong and it should be raised to at least 14. We need to work out ways of showing parliamentarians that if they do the right thing, if they're a little bit brave, then they will be backed in by their community.
Thank you. The next question.
Can I add something to that as well? A lot of the rhetoric we hear, particularly from politicians, is a real othering of people, of disconnecting certain groups of people from the rest of society and saying, well, that's okay, that group of people is expendable, or, it doesn't matter what happens to them. And I think there needs to be sort of a retelling of who it is that our community is, and that community includes everyone, even people in prison, even people who offend, people who are disadvantaged. There's such a disconnect between so many groups of people that lots of politicians make us like to make us feel okay about just worrying about ourselves, but we really need to think more expansively and inclusively about who makes up our community. And the fact that kids can go into jail and then come out means they're always part of our community. And we can talk about so many different cohorts of people in Australia, but I think it's really important to people, for people to get across to their local MPs, the politicians that supposedly represent them, about caring for the whole of community, that people need, we need to see responses that ultimately do protect community. Prisons don't protect community. The other programs, the other supports that Sophie, Nick and Julie have all spoken about, these are the things that keep community safe, and that's what we want to see more investment in.
Yeah. The next question is from Olivia Greenwell. She says, is raising the age in legislation enough to also affect the cultural change necessary to correct over-policing and biases in court, or is it just the starting point? I might start with you, Sophie.
Yeah, sure. And then I'd love to throw to Julie to talk a bit about what might need to happen at a community level for policing in particular to change. I think the answer is it's just the start. Changing the law to mean that children under the age of 14 can't go to prison is super important. That basically sets a new sort of benchmark and a new norm within our communities that say, when we think about children under the age of 14, we need to think about them differently, not as potential offenders, but as kids that we have a duty of care to look after and to nurture and to make sure they're given all those opportunities to grow and thrive. I think it also puts some responsibility on different institutions. So instead of, the education system, instead of child protection, instead of the Department of Housing, all being able to call the police and say, no, this is a problem for the police, this is a problem for the police, they actually have to go, no, we have a duty of care towards these young people and their families. So what are we going to do to make sure this family has adequate housing? Or what are we going to do when this kid is disengaging from school? Instead of just suspending them or expelling them or calling the police, we have an obligation towards that child to make sure they get a good education. So I think it's just the start. But we also know that racism and discrimination, extend through all of these institutions. And there's a long way to go, I think, to make sure that there's genuine cultural reform within our whole communities and within these specific institutions. What we don't want is to create a system where we change the law, but because we don't change any of the other drivers, because we don't address any of the other underlying things that leads to kids getting into trouble, like housing, like troubles at home, like the education system not working for kids, it just means that as soon as the child turns 14, the police get involved and arrest them and send them to prison. That's also not going to be a good outcome for that young person or their families. So it really needs to be a combined reform of both the sort of social services, the big institutions that government run that can either help or harm people. Centrelink is a great example of an institution that could help prop families up, help families when they're struggling, but instead often harms them. We need to combine that with raising the age to make sure that we have that sort of hard protection in place for children under the age of 14.
Yeah. Julie, coming to you next, raising the age, Sophie's just said it's just one of many things that we need to do. You work at the community level. What other things would you like to see change, or do you think the community needs to help make that shift?
I just think for any sort of change, people need to listening to those people with lived experiences in the community, because they're the ones, or we're all the ones who are struggling. Where I feel these voices need to be heard as well. With my work with Just Reinvest, like we have, my daughter is one of the youth ambassadors, so her and another youth ambassador, where, they've started talking with young people around, what their issues that they put up with and being in and out of that system. So just their group, like yarning with one another and listening to one another's stories, they're talking about what they would like to see change. Where I think this is a good starting point, because these are the young fellas who are going through all those issues, and around like their group who they meet with and stuff. Now they've also got they started up an OzTag team for young people out here in Mount Druitt, where they've gone through a couple of comps now, but them doing that, a lot of these young fellas who are a part of that OzTag team, a lot of services out here in Mount Druitt are saying that they won't engage, where these young kids, this is their idea, this is what they're doing, and it's working. Like, because of lockdown now, they're going into their third competition where this is going really good, and it's what they wanted to, create, and they're doing that for themselves.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, generated from the kids themselves. What about as a parent? What kind of support do people need? Is it help keeping kids at school? Is it, I'm not kind of clear on what are some of the things that are missing that people would really like or need access to, that people struggle to access?
It's a bit of everything, because it's the same within the education system. Like I went through it with my own daughter. Like, she wasn't given a long enough chance at school to see change with her behaviour and whatever. Like, she was given a week and a half, and I was told that scene wasn't for her. She needs to be in another situation. I said, but you don't even know my daughter. She's been here like a week and a half. How can you say a school setting is not for her, where they didn't want to keep her there or give her that chance? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's frustrating.
Yeah. It would be incredibly frustrating. The next question I've got here is probably for you, Nick. It's from Steve Caruana. He says, evidence from WA shows that more than 1 in 3 young people detained in Banksia Hill had FASD, and other studies show young people with disabilities are vastly overrepresented in youth detention centres. Nick and Sophie's experience also demonstrates that there's awareness of this. So what needs to be done to divert young people with disabilities from the justice system, and what role do police have to play in that? Maybe to you first, Nick.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll just take a step back just for the wider audience. So we're talking about here is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder that's caused by the developing child in pregnancy being affected by alcohol. And lots of mothers aren't aware that they're pregnant when they're still drinking. So it's a common issue. This is not a thing about blame or fault. This is something that happens across all walks of our society, and it affects lots of different groups. And the outcome is a collection of children who have really severe neurodevelopmental disabilities. Talking about children who have disabilities in at least three main areas, whether it's speech or language or cognition and intellect, executive function, attention, depression, anxiety, these kinds of things. So they're major functions that you lose at least 3 areas on. So it's significant disability. And that study from Western Australia that was referenced has really become a really seminal piece of work for us to understand what this true heavy burden is. The other thing about that study was that it was actually amongst those 99 children they looked at, so 36 of them had FASD, but 90% of them had a severe disability in at least one neurodevelopmental domain. So there was a huge component of disability within detention centres. What needs to happen? So this goes back a little bit to the Royal Commission. So the Royal Commission had a direct recommendation that every child should be screened for FASD, and that probably means actually screening for lots of neurodevelopmental issues. And that's not just children in detention, that's children who hit justice in any way. It's probably children who hit child protective services as well. We need to be able to have a process of trying to identify early who these children are who've got existing disabilities. And what else needs to happen? Well, some of it's the upstream stuff that we've talked about. So being able to find children who are coming through other services, whether it's through education or health services or anywhere else, that we find them and see them at a young age, as young as possible. And then it's even further upstream work, right? So this is support for families, for young mothers, re-engaging with community, identifying healthy practices, and again, this stuff is, gets well outside of, a doctor or someone else providing any care and input. This is about communities coming together and having the support of their society to lead on these issues. But that's where we're going to find those key intervention points, I think.
The next question I've got is from Sheridan Ward, and there's a couple of questions that touch on this as well. But Sheridan's question is, how does the minimum age of 10 years old compare to other countries? And there's a couple of questions here about, are there examples from here or overseas of successful programs and responses to this? I'm not sure who wants to answer that one. Mina, is that one for you maybe, or Sophie?
So the median age around the world is 14 years of age for criminal responsibility. So in terms of that, Australia's out of step. And earlier this year, we had the Universal Periodic Review, which is a process as part of the United Nations where countries' human rights records are examined by other countries. And at that Universal Periodic Review earlier this year, 30 other countries called out Australia for having such a low age of criminal responsibility. I saw someone posted in the comments that the United Nations has also said that the minimum age of criminal responsibility should be 14, taking into account child developmental processes and such. So the Australian government has just kind of said, well, that's an issue for the states and territories. And so, as Sophie said, that's why, lots of work is going into working with the states and territories to try and raise the age across each of those jurisdictions. Yeah, there's so many other countries that have criminal responsibility at 14 years of age. There's a number of European countries, South American countries, African countries, Asian countries. There's a lot of different countries. And there's lots of countries that also have as high as 18, because I saw someone post in the chat as well that we should raise the age to 18. But absolutely, we need to look to overseas jurisdictions for those positive examples of what does work. But, I think like Julie and Sophie and Nick, like we've all said, it's really looking at where the gaps are in a child's development and thinking about what do they not have that puts them in a position that makes them more vulnerable to becoming engaged with the criminal legal system. So where are the gaps in learning in development, the gaps in connection to culture, in terms of family. How are we addressing those things in a child's life? And are we addressing them earlier rather than later? And, there are lots of different things that we wouldn't necessarily see as diversion programs or early intervention programs that actually are those things of like Julie said, the kids engaging in OzTag, engaging in something that keeps them connected with the groups around, with other kids around them, that keeps them healthy, that keeps them active. Things like homework programs or after school programs that kids can go to. Cultural connections. So many Aboriginal organisations have so many different programs that connect kids with their culture and their identity. And we know, especially for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, once we're strong in our identity and our culture, there's so much that we can achieve. That's such a crucial element to it. So whenever we do think about what things need to be put in place, specifically for Aboriginal kids and Torres Strait Islander kids, culture needs to be front and centre because it is a source of strength for us.
Yeah, Julie, can I come back to you on that one? You were just talking about successful programs that your daughter has helped foster in your community. What are your observations of what works for communities?
Well, just with my daughter and these, the two youth ambassadors, with them yarning with the young people out here in Mount Druitt. So I don't know, it's easier for them to listen to one another to say what they feel needs to change. So with their group that meets regularly, it's called Mounty Yarn. So they meet and have these conversations with the young people, and out of that group, we're hoping that they create some sort of resource that can be shared with other services. Giving them an idea like this is work type thing where this has been going for 3 comps, and it's just been going so good. So it's just doing things differently, and these kids wanting change as well, and want services to work differently because they know, they're not getting that support. So it's a good thing that they're doing that.
Definitely. And we've certainly seen through the pandemic that, for example, Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations have been, in often cases, more successful than Australia's general medical system at protecting mob and communities, keeping the pandemic out. Unfortunately, that's broken down recently, but it's definitely, you can see those success stories, not just in systems like Just Reinvest, but elsewhere where they're led by Aboriginal communities. I did want to just ask to kind of finish up. We've got a couple of people here commenting on, it must be very costly to imprison children, and that you've talked a lot about then it gets them in a vicious cycle. There's a lot of recidivism and that type of thing. A question here from Rosemary Rowe says, does it cost $500,000 to imprison our kids? And is Australia in breach of international law? Sophie, I might come to you on that one. How expensive is it?
Yeah, extremely expensive. So about the cheapest that you can lock up a child is about $500,000, but it goes up to, in some places it's well over $800,000 for to lock up a child in a prison. I mean, if you think about that, it is a fraction of that cost to invest in community-driven programs to support young people. So we're not just talking about that. So the big Deloitte study, you can, I'll try and post it in the chats, but you can just Google it, which basically looks at what would it cost if we took all of these kids out of the punitive criminal legal system and instead we invested that money in our community sector, in family supports, in raising Centrelink above the poverty line, in community-controlled health services. What would the difference be? It's a fraction of the cost. So they found, they looked at in the Northern Territory implementing all of the Royal Commission recommendations, and it turns out to be far cheaper to implement this vast set of reforms than to continue business as usual, locking up kids. Even, it's a relatively small number of children in the Northern Territory. It's sort of around 50 children at any given time. Locking up those kids costs more than instead reforming the criminal justice system, keeping those kids out, investing in the health and community services instead. We also know when it comes to the long-term impacts, a child who is put in prison is so much more likely to be unable to work, finish their education, end up unemployed, have mental and physical health issues and disabilities in the future, even suffer premature death. When you factor all of that in, and hopefully we can do this for reasons beyond just a cost-benefit analysis, but if you just want to look at that in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, it is obviously so much more expensive to deny all of these young people the possibility of their futures being in gainful employment, owning a home, finishing education, contributing to the economy. You take all that away when you lock a child up and deny them the ability to pursue, their hopes and dreams and their own ambitions. So in short, it's much cheaper, much cheaper to keep kids out of the criminal legal system and to instead invest in the type of services that keep kids healthy and keep families and communities together.
Yeah, Julie, I might come to you to finish up. In an ideal world, what kind of future do you want, just even in your own community in Mount Druitt, for kids like your daughter? What are we aiming for?
Creating change, around policing, around services. It's around a bit of everything, but creating change, for those who are struggling and just doing things differently. Like, as an example, like my daughter was, in custody over 100 days, and it's like over $1,400 per day. Like, when you think about how much money is wasted, where we should be looking at doing things differently, or government should be listening to people in the community, how things should, work.
And if people want to know how they can support the campaign, Sophie, where should they go?
I just posted some links in the chat, but if you want to sign up to the campaign, if you haven't signed the petition yet, you can go to raisetheage.org.au/change the record. Or if you want to take some more direct action and contact your MP, we have some easy tools set up already on changetherecord.org.au/raise the age. Thank you so much.
I want to thank Julie, Mina, Sophie and Nick for their time today. Thank you so much. We'll have to wrap it up there. We had about 600 people on the line with us today. Thank you all so much for tuning in for this important webinar. This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel, which you can find at australiainstitute.tv. All our latest research and content is at our website, australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT, and our producer is Jennifer Macy. You can find her at Jennifer Macy, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Thank you for listening to Follow the Money, and I hope you're having a great summer.